The focus of USA Today's online outlet is basically, it's another way for people to get their news and information. One of the things that our publisher has recently been talking about is being less focused on, well, we have to sell people a newspaper, and more focused on, there are a multitude of ways that people can get their news and information. The website is one, mobile devices are another, the newspaper is another. And so it's more about, there are different distribution channels, there are different platforms, and all of them have value. Let's get our news and information out there. And so our website is kind of designed with that in mind. It's not to augment something else. It's not to, it's designed as a way of getting people, of informing people, of giving them an opportunity to get our news, our information, our content. So the Online News Association, or ONA, is an association of independent to big media company journalists who are looking at how to use the web and digital journalism, to do their work, to get their stuff out. So it's really about, educating, it's about training, it's about coming up with new ideas. I mean, a lot of what's happening in the journalism industry isn't that people are tuning out. It's not that people don't want journalism. They want it more now. They want more journalism now more than ever. Overall, consumption of journalism is skyrocketing, which is great. There are some business challenges in the journalism industry about how do journalism companies, especially traditional organizations, continue to operate and thrive in what's a very rapidly changing business dynamic. So ONA is also looking at ways of dealing with that. So it's really about supporting online journalism, supporting online journalists, trying to figure out best practices, training, those sorts of things. I think when people talk about social media, they're talking about things like Twitter and Facebook and things like that. But social media, as defined that way, is really just a digital extension of the analog, world. I remember when my mom would see something in the newspaper, usually something she wanted me to stop doing or something, and she'd cut it out of the newspaper and mail it to me. Well, that's social media. In the same way that now she'll see a story and she'll send it to me on Facebook. Or a friend of mine on Twitter will say, hey, here's a really interesting article I just read. You might be interested in it as well. So that's one way of using social media, which is to inform people, to sort of redistribute your content. And that's the extension of the regular world, the analog world. Social media also provides another way for journalists to reach sources. Again, it's an extension of other things. I mean, journalists would go to events and do networking and try and meet people, and that's social media as well. In the digital sphere, journalists may use Twitter to see what the zeitgeist is saying. They may pay attention to Facebook and see if they can find common threads that people are talking about, or reach sources. I mean, I remember years ago when I first started in journalism using a reverse lookup directory, and I'd look up an address and find the phone number for that address. Well, now we might search for that person on Facebook. So there are tools in the journalism toolbox, and that's no different than any other tool. And I think that social media is a range on the spectrum of journalism, from your neighbor telling you, hey, did you hear about so and so down the street, to reading a long article in a highbrow magazine. So to me, it's all part of the spectrum, and it has extensions back into the old days in traditional world. It used to be that in the golden age of journalism, where you had 3 networks and a handful of big newspapers, or maybe 1 or 2 newspapers in each big city. These brands had credibility, but they also had basically a monopoly on access to the public, to their readership, which is why they were valuable. It's why advertisers wanted to give them all their money. That's changed in the online world. Now I have, it's no longer about what newspapers in the Washington market. I can read newspapers from all over the world, and I do online. And so, and now the barriers of entry are so low that journalists, they don't have to go work for a major news organization anymore. They can start things on their own. Now, brands still have credibility, right? There's a legacy of credibility that they have that's really valuable to them. But journalists are figuring out, independent journalists are figuring out how they can create, credibility on their own. And so I think there's a bit of a power shift. It used to be when I graduated from journalism school, the goal was to work at a small paper, to a medium paper, and then to a large paper, because you wanted to get the bigger audience, and that was how you did it. They had the audience. And that was the only way you could reach them, right? Unless I had a couple $1 million to buy my own press, that was it. Now, with $10 or $15, I can buy my press in the form of a URL on a blog. It doesn't come with the instant credibility and the brand and the audience, but I can build that. So I think there is a bit of a power shift there. And you take someone like a David Pogue or a Walt Mossberg or any number of others, and now people identify with them. They don't necessarily identify David Pogue with the New York Times. They identify David Pogue with David Pogue. And he can, I'm sure Bill Keller stays awake at night and sometimes thinking, boy, I really hope David Pogue doesn't decide to do this for himself. And so, I think there is a power shift happening there, at least at some of the high levels. And over time, that may continue to change at the lower levels as well.